A mother's last breath leaves behind 4 children. What happens next will break your heart. In a small, quiet town, the lives of 4 siblings are torn apart when their mother, Grace, is taken from them by illness. At just 13, Evangeline vows to keep her family together no matter what, but the world has other plans. Her love for her siblings and a promise made to her dying mother will push her to fight against impossible odds. Just when all seems lost, a miraculous reunion and a message of hope change their lives forever. The town was one of those places that people often forgot existed. A small dot on the map of Pennsylvania, where houses huddled together like old friends, leaning into each other as if to share their secrets. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the chill of impending winter. The streets were cobblestone, their cracks filled with fallen leaves, red and gold, giving the whole place a sense of quiet finality. In this forgotten corner of the world, it felt as though time had slowed down, weighed by something unseen but heavy. At the very edge of town stood a house. It was small, its paint faded and peeling, its shutters hanging askew as though they too were tired of standing against the relentless passage of time. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tightly, hiding the life, or what little was left of it, inside. It was the kind of house that no one noticed anymore, except for those who knew the grief held within its walls. Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the soft sound of breathing, labored and slow, and the occasional creak of the floorboards under the weight of restless feet. The room was dim, the last light of day filtering through a crack in the curtains, casting a dull glow over the scene. Evangeline sat by the window, her small body tense, her eyes dark and haunted. She was just 13, but the weight on her shoulders made her feel much older. Her long brown hair, usually tied back in a neat braid, had come loose, strands falling messily around her face. She looked out at the world beyond the glass, but she wasn't really seeing it. Her thoughts were far away, tangled in the worry that had taken root in her chest and refused to let go. On the other side of the room, her little sister, Lily, clutched a ragged doll to her chest. Lily was only 7, and her wide eyes darted between Evangeline and the figure lying in the bed. Her doll, once a beloved companion, was now worn and frayed, much like Lily herself. She didn't understand everything that was happening, but she knew enough to be scared. Jacob, barely 2 years old, wandered aimlessly around the room. He didn't know why the house felt so heavy, why everyone was so quiet. His babbling nonsense words were the only sound that broke through the oppressive silence. He would look up now and then, searching the faces of his sisters, but they were too lost in their own thoughts to notice. Then there was Noah, the baby. Only a year old, he was cradled in Evangeline's lap, his small hands clutching her shirt, as if he could sense the uncertainty that filled the room. He was quiet, more so than usual, and Evangeline was grateful for that. She didn't think she had the strength to soothe him, not now. In the bed by the window lay their mother, Grace. Once she had been the heart of the house, a woman full of life and laughter, but now her body was a shadow of what it had once been, ravaged by the illness that had taken hold of her with cruel determination. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the fading light, and her breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps. Grace had always been a strong woman, the kind of person who faced hardship with a smile and a gentle touch. But even she had not been able to fight the sickness that had crept in slowly, stealing away pieces of her until all that remained was a shell of the mother Evangeline remembered. The room was cold, despite the fire that crackled weakly in the hearth. The air felt heavy, thick with the knowledge of what was to come. Death hung over them like a storm cloud, inevitable and inescapable. Evangeline watched her mother, her heart aching with every labored breath. She knew what was coming, had known for days now, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. Her mind raced with unspoken questions, each one more terrifying than the last. What will happen to us? Who will take care of us? How can I keep us together? Grace stirred, her hand twitching weakly at her side. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they found Evangeline's across the room. There was a sadness in them, a deep, unspoken sorrow that cut through Evangeline like a knife. Grace had always been able to say so much without speaking a word, but now her silence was unbearable. "Evie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. a faint echo of what it had once been. Evangeline's heart clenched, and she hurried to her mother's side, kneeling by the bed. "I'm here, Mama," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her efforts to be strong. For a long moment, Grace didn't say anything. Her eyes fluttered shut again, and Evangeline thought she might have fallen asleep. But then, just as the wind outside picked up, rattling the window, Grace spoke again. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice so quiet that Evangeline had to lean in closer to hear. "Promise me you'll take care of them." The words hit Evangeline like a blow to the chest. Her throat tightened, and tears burned in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to beg her mother not to leave them, not to make her carry this burden. But she couldn't. She had to be strong, for her mother, for her siblings. She swallowed her fear and nodded. "I promise," she whispered back, her voice cracking. "I'll take care of them, Mama. I'll keep us together." Grace's hand, frail and cold, reached out to clasp Evangeline's. She gave a small, almost imperceptible squeeze before the strength left her fingers. Her eyes fluttered shut and her breathing slowed even more. For a moment, Evangeline held her breath, hoping against hope that her mother would take another breath, that they still had more time. But then, the room went still, too still, and Evangeline knew. The silence that followed was suffocating. The weight of the promise she had just made pressed down on her, heavy and unforgiving. She felt the responsibility settle into her bones, wrapping itself around her like a chain. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was a protector, a guardian. Everything depended on her now. Outside, the last of the leaves gave up their hold on the branches, falling to the ground with a soft, soundless whisper. Winter was coming, not just to the land, but to the hearts of those left inside the small, weathered house. Evangeline stayed by her mother's side long after the life had slipped away. The room grew colder as the night pressed in, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Her siblings had fallen asleep on a pile of blankets by the fire, their small bodies curled together for warmth. Only Noah remained awake, his wide eyes watching Evangeline with a quiet curiosity, unaware of the monumental shift that had just occurred. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to creep through the window that Evangeline finally stirred. She gently placed Noah beside his siblings and stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She looked down at her mother's still form one last time, the weight of her promise sinking deeper into her soul. "I'll take care of them," she whispered to the empty room, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I'll keep them safe. I promise." With that, she turned away, her heart heavy, and began the long, uncertain journey of keeping her family together. The days after Grace's death were heavy with grief, but Evangeline had no time to fully process her loss. Each morning she woke before dawn, moving mechanically through the house, trying to keep everything together. The house was colder, quieter, the absence of their mother hanging like a shadow over everything. But Evangeline couldn't let herself falter. She had made a promise. Lily clung to her like never before, her small hands trembling with the unspoken fear that their world was falling apart. At night, she whispered, "Is Mommy really gone forever, Evie?" Evangeline's heart twisted every time. She had no real answer, no comfort to offer, but she always forced a smile. "She's watching over us, Lily. We're not alone." Jacob, too young to understand, still wandered the house calling out, "Mama?" His little voice would echo in the empty rooms, and Evangeline would pick him up, holding him tightly, trying to keep her own tears at bay. Noah, the baby, was quiet and observant, his wide eyes seeming to notice everything yet incapable of comprehending the profound loss they were all enduring. The days bled into each other. Evangeline did her best to provide for her siblings, but their food supplies were running low, and the winter winds were beginning to bite at the thin walls of their home. She knew she needed help, but asking felt like failure, like breaking the promise she had made to her mother. How could she tell people she wasn't enough to keep her family safe? One cold afternoon, Evangeline found herself standing at the entrance of the small-town church. Her pride battled with her desperation as she clutched Noah in her arms, his weight the only thing grounding her in the moment. She had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, debating whether to ask for help. Finally, she pushed the door open. the warmth inside flooding over her like a painful reminder of everything they had lost. An elderly woman approached, her face soft with concern. "Child, what can we do for you?" she asked kindly, seeing the weariness in Evangeline's eyes. Evangeline swallowed her pride, her voice barely above a whisper. We don't have much food left. I need something for my brothers and sister." Her hands shook as she spoke, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her small frame. The woman didn't hesitate. She placed a comforting hand on Evangeline's arm. "Of course, dear. Let us help you. You don't have to carry this burden alone." Evangeline left with a basket of food, but the relief was short-lived. She knew this small act of kindness wouldn't last them long. The cold of winter was closing in, and their house felt emptier, more fragile with each passing day. The nights were the hardest. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the fire struggled to keep the room warm. Evangeline would stay awake, listening to Lily's quiet breathing and Jacob's small murmurs in their sleep, wondering how long she could keep up this facade of strength. Every day felt like a battle she was losing. Then came the night everything changed. It was late, the wind fierce outside, when there was a knock at the door. Evangeline's heart stopped. No one visited anymore. She approached the door cautiously, her breath shallow. When she opened it, the icy wind rushed in, revealing a tall man in a dark coat, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "I'm looking for Evangeline Miller," he said, his voice low but steady. Evangeline felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "That's me," she answered, gripping the doorframe to steady herself. "I'm from Child Protective Services," the man said, holding up a badge. "We've been informed about your situation. We need to talk." Her blood ran cold. Child Protective Services. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had feared this moment, felt it looming every time someone in town gave her a pitying look or whispered behind her back. But now it was here, and she wasn't ready. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can't take them. I promised my mother I'd take care of them. We're fine." The man's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "I know you've been doing your best, but you're just a child. It's not safe for you to be raising your siblings on your own. We're here to help." Panic surged through Evangeline. She slammed the door shut, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran to the bedroom where Lily and Jacob were huddled under the blankets. "Someone's here," she whispered urgently, scooping Noah into her arms. "They want to take us away." Lily's wide eyes filled with fear. "You promised, Evie. You promised we'd stay together." Evangeline's heart shattered. She held them all close, her mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this, but deep down she knew she was running out of time, running out of options. Outside, the knocking grew louder. The world was closing in on them, and Evangeline didn't know how to keep her family together anymore. The knocking at the door grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the small house. Evangeline stood frozen in the middle of the room, her heart pounding in her ears. She could feel the fear from her siblings as they huddled around her, and in that moment, she felt utterly powerless. The door creaked open with a slow groan. She had forgotten to lock it. Footsteps echoed through the hallway as the man from Child Protective Services stepped inside. His presence filled the small space, but there was no threat in his voice, just a quiet firmness. "Evangeline, I'm not here to hurt you," he called gently, as if trying to reassure her. "We need to make sure you and your siblings are safe." Evangeline tightened her hold on Noah, who whimpered in her arms. Lily pressed herself closer to her, and Jacob's small hands clung to her leg. They looked to her for protection, but she didn't know how to protect them from this. How could she? She stepped forward, trembling but determined, her voice barely steady. "You can't take them. They're my family. I promised my mother I'd keep them together. Please, don't do this." The man's eyes softened with sympathy, but his expression remained firm. "I know you've done your best, Evangeline, but this isn't just about keeping a promise. It's about what's best for your brothers and sister. You're too young to bear this burden alone. It's not safe." Evangeline's heart clenched with desperation. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I've taken care of them. We've made it this far. I'll find a way, I swear. Don't take them away from me." The man took a step closer, lowering his voice as if to soften the blow. "I'm sorry, but I've already called for help. They'll be here soon to take you and your siblings somewhere safe." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Evangeline could barely breathe as her world crumbled around her. The promise she had made to her mother, the one she had clung to with everything she had, was slipping away from her, no matter how tightly she tried to hold on. Tears streamed down her face as she sank to her knees, clutching Noah tighter. Lily and Jacob followed, their small bodies pressed against her, their fear mirroring her own. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this. I promised I'd keep them safe. I promised." The man's face was filled with regret, but he didn't waver. He stepped back as the sound of tires crunching on snow filled the air outside. The car had arrived. Moments later, 2 women from Child Protective Services entered the house, their eyes filled with compassion, but also a sense of duty. One of them knelt down in front of Evangeline, her voice soft but firm. "Sweetheart, we're going to take you and your siblings somewhere safe. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Evangeline shook her head, backing away as far as she could, holding her siblings close. "Please, we need to stay together. Don't take them away from me." The women exchanged glances, and the one closest to her reached out a gentle hand. "You've done everything you could, Evangeline. But it's time to let us help." Evangeline's heart screamed against the reality unfolding before her. She had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and yet it wasn't enough. Nothing she did was ever enough. One of the women gently took Lily by the hand, coaxing her toward the door. Lily looked back at Evangeline with tear-filled eyes. "Evie, what's happening? Where are we going?" Evangeline forced a smile through her tears, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, Lily, but I promise I'll see you again soon." Jacob clung to Evangeline's leg, and Noah, still in her arms, began to cry softly. One of the women reached out for him, and Evangeline felt a sharp pain in her chest as she hesitated. Slowly, with trembling hands, she passed Noah over, her heart breaking as his small fingers slipped from her grasp. The women guided Lily and Jacob to the door, and Evangeline stood in the doorway, watching helplessly as they were led outside into the cold night. Snow began to fall softly, covering the ground in a blanket of white. The world seemed to move in slow motion as the car doors closed, the engine roaring to life. Evangeline stood there, rooted to the spot, her arms empty, her world shattered. She watched as the car carrying her siblings disappeared down the road, leaving nothing behind but the cold wind and the silence. She had failed. The promise she had made to her mother, the one she had fought so hard to keep, was broken. And now she was alone. Evangeline stood in the doorway long after the car had vanished from sight, the cold seeping into her bones. The world outside was quiet, blanketed in snow, but inside, her heart was a storm of guilt and grief. Her body felt heavy, almost numb, as if the weight of what had just happened had drained all the life from her. She had failed. The promise she had whispered to her mother, the one she had clung to with all her strength, now felt meaningless. She had fought to keep her siblings together, to protect them from the cruel reality of the world, but it hadn't been enough. Nothing she had done mattered in the end. They were gone, and she was alone in a house that now felt emptier than ever. The cold wind blew through the open door, pulling her back to reality. Slowly, she closed it, her hands trembling. The house was eerily quiet. No laughter, no small voices calling her name. The silence was unbearable. She stumbled to the fireplace, staring at the dying embers of the fire. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. There was no use in fighting them anymore. Days passed in a blur. Evangeline moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps hollow on the wooden floors. She wandered aimlessly from room to room, each space filled with memories of her siblings, memories that now felt like painful reminders of everything she had lost. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The few people from the church who had once helped them knocked on the door occasionally, offering food and words of comfort, but Evangeline barely noticed them. She was too lost in her own despair. It wasn't until Mrs. Bennet returned that something began to shift. Mrs. Bennet had always been kind, offering help when Evangeline needed it most. This time, however, she didn't knock and leave. She stepped inside the house, her eyes filled with concern as she found Evangeline sitting in front of the fireplace, staring into the cold ashes. "Evangeline, child," she said softly, sitting beside her. "You can't keep doing this. You've been through more than anyone should bear, but you're not alone. You've never been alone." Evangeline didn't respond. She couldn't. The ache in her chest felt too deep, too consuming. Mrs. Bennet reached out and gently touched Evangeline's hand. "You made a promise, I know, and you've done everything you could to keep it. But sometimes life doesn't go the way we want, no matter how hard we fight. That doesn't mean you failed. It just means it's time to let others help." Evangeline looked up, her eyes hollow and red from crying. "I promised her," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I promised I'd keep them together." "And you did, Evangeline," Mrs. Bennet said, her voice steady but gentle. "In every way that matters. You fought for them. You gave everything you had. But now it's time to take care of yourself too. You can't help them if you're broken." For the first time since her siblings had been taken, something in Mrs. Bennet's words pierced through the fog of grief. Evangeline had spent so long carrying the weight of her family, so long believing that it was her responsibility alone, that the idea of letting go felt like failure. But maybe Mrs. Bennet was right. Maybe taking care of herself didn't mean abandoning her promise. It just meant finding a new way forward. "I don't know how to move on," Evangeline whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Bennet squeezed her hand. "You don't have to know everything right now. One step at a time, and you don't have to do it alone." The warmth in Mrs. Bennet's voice, the steadiness of her presence, was like a lifeline. Evangeline hadn't realized how much she had needed someone to tell her that it was okay to ask for help, to remind her that she wasn't as alone as she had felt. Over the next few days, with Mrs. Bennet's support, Evangeline began to take small steps forward. She accepted the food offered by the church, started eating again, and slowly began to engage with the world outside the walls of her house. It wasn't easy. Each step felt like dragging her feet through thick mud, but the weight of despair began to lift little by little, and then she started visiting her siblings. Each week, Evangeline made the journey to the foster care home where Lily, Jacob, and Noah had been placed. The first visit was the hardest. Walking into that unfamiliar building, seeing her siblings in the care of others, had felt like another blow to her already fragile heart. But the moment Lily ran into her arms, sobbing with relief, and Jacob clung to her leg, babbling excitedly, something in Evangeline began to heal. They were still her family. They were still connected. Noah, now a little older, toddled toward her with wide eyes, his small hand reaching out for her as though trying to remember the sister he had been separated from too soon. Each visit strengthened the bond that had never truly been broken, despite the distance. They laughed, played, and shared stories of what had happened since they had last seen each other. And though the pain of their separation lingered, these visits became a beacon of hope for Evangeline. She knew she had to get them back. Determined to reunite her family, Evangeline returned to school, throwing herself into her studies with a renewed sense of purpose. Her teachers noticed the change in her, the fierce determination that drove her to succeed. She worked tirelessly, knowing that education was the key to building a future where she could care for her siblings again. As months passed, her dream of becoming a social worker began to take shape. She realized that her own experiences gave her a unique understanding of the foster care system, of the struggles faced by families like hers. She wanted to help other children who were going through what she had endured, to fight for families to stay together. This new purpose filled her with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Then, one day, everything changed. The phone call came early in the morning. Evangeline had been sitting at the kitchen table going over her schoolwork when the phone rang. It was the caseworker overseeing her siblings' care. "Evangeline," the woman's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable warmth in her tone. "I have some good news. After reviewing your progress and with the support of Mrs. Bennet and the community, we've decided that you're eligible to apply for guardianship of your siblings." Evangeline's heart stopped. Guardianship? Does that mean they can come home? The caseworker's smile could be heard through the phone. Yes, it's not immediate. There's paperwork, and you'll need to go through a formal review process, but if all goes well, your siblings can come home. Tears of relief and joy streamed down Evangeline's face. She had fought so hard, and now the day she had dreamed of was within reach. "I'll do whatever it takes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Whatever I have to do." The next few months were filled with court hearings, paperwork, and evaluations, but Evangeline didn't waver. She was more determined than ever, and with the help of Mrs. Bennett and the church community, she navigated the complex process with hope in her heart. Finally, the day came. Standing in the courthouse, her hands trembling, Evangeline listened as the judge reviewed her case. She spoke from the heart, explaining her love for her siblings and the promise she had made to her mother. She talked about the progress she had made, about the community's support, and how she was ready to bring her family back together. The room was silent as the judge considered her words. Evangeline held her breath, her entire future hanging in the balance. Then, the judge smiled. "You've shown remarkable strength and resilience, Evangeline. I'm granting you guardianship." Evangeline's heart soared. Tears of joy filled her eyes as she thanked the judge, barely able to believe that after all the pain and struggle, she had finally succeeded. She had kept her promise. The day her siblings came home was filled with laughter and tears. Lily ran into her arms, clinging to her as though she would never let go. Jacob, his face alight with joy, ran through the house, rediscovering their home. And Noah, now walking confidently, toddled after them, his wide eyes filled with wonder. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house was filled with life again. The silence that had once haunted Evangeline was replaced by the sound of her siblings' laughter. They were together again, just as she had promised. As the sun set that evening, casting a golden glow over their small home, Evangeline stood at the window, watching her brothers and sister play outside. The weight of her promise no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a gift. She had fulfilled it, not in the way she had imagined, but in a way that made her stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. Somewhere, she imagined her mother watching over them, proud of the strength and love that had brought them through the darkest of times. They were a family, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Thank you so much for following this emotional journey to the end. We hope Evangeline's story and her fight to keep her family together touched your heart as deeply as it did ours. If this story inspired you, don't forget to leave a comment below. Let us know which part of the story moved you the most and how it made you feel. Your feedback means the world to us. If you enjoyed this, give the video a thumbs up, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel, Driven by Stories, for more stories like this, stories filled with heart, hope, and inspiration.